what I'm going to be showing you guys are some examples of some vape items that we've confiscated from the school year of 18-19. A lot of times when we're having these conversations about these different products, the thing that's most common is the parents that we traditionally talk with basically say, well, it's not my kid, or does it happen that often? In this box here, it's rather heavy, and I'm going to tilt it forward so you can kind of see the example. This is this school year's, last school year, 18s and 19s, haul of things that we've confiscated. There are about 42 items that we don't have here that was taken into evidence by our police department. So I'm just going to show you some examples so you'll know what to look for. And there are some newer items that I'm going to tell you about that I hope you guys kind of pay attention to, because it's an epidemic that's kind of plaguing our country, and I'm not sure of how we're going to stop it moving forward. But one of the first items I want to show you, these were the larger kind of products. This is it's a vape apparatus. This top unscrews. I don't want to unscrew it because the liquid kind of comes out, but you can fill it up with things of this nature. All these products contain THC. A lot of times you can read it right in the writing. I'll pass around some of the packets while you're here that you guys can kind of read the packaging of, like the jewel pods. There are so many different types. But basically, going back to this, they take this stuff.
Nicotine, not THC, by the way.
Nicotine, I said THC?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Nicotine, all of these have nicotine in it. And they do have some that are THC based as well. I don't have those are legal. I don't want to get arrested, so we definitely don't want to have those in my possession. But anyway, so the oils look like this. We have different types of oil. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen this one. This one here says it's CBD based. So that is one of the
endocannabinoids related to THC, but not psychoactive.
That's right. And this one here's flavor is blue raspberry. What they're trying to, in my opinion, market this to some of our younger population. So you kind of need to be mindful of that. And these things go in all different sizes. These are some of our new smaller ones. As you can see, that they kept getting a little creative with these things. They have this is a fogger. These are commonly sold in the store like cigarettes. They're really small. Kind of looks like a USB device. You have some here that looks like maybe a charger or a lighter. Different brands. They even have them now that they look like Apple Watches. They have them where they look like small little cartridges. I'm trying to find one of my smaller ones. This one here is actually one that, so if you see one of these, this top here unscrews, and most of these that we've seen on our campus traditionally contains the THC. We had it was a 2-pack that we got these. The reason why I still have this one, because it did not contain marijuana. So they allowed me to keep this one to show this one as an example. But it's a charging port. You push this little button, you screw it in, and you can smoke out of these things. But they're super dangerous, super dangerous. We have a couple of other ones. These are the jewel devices. These jewel devices come with, I'm sorry, I can't find anything in this box. It's so much. They come with these little cartridges. These little cartridges you take off, and you take it and you insert it in here. And now what you have here is, most parents traditionally think these things are USB devices. They come with a little charger you can plug into the computer. It'll even look like an antenna for your computer. So you have to be very careful about monitoring what's going on with your kids. I don't have the one that looks like a lighter on me now, but it's just so many different devices. So if you get an opportunity, I'll be happy to show you some of these things. This lovely lady here, Dr. Holliday, she's going to go into detail about how these things can, harm the brain, the different parts of your bodies, and she's way more knowledgeable than I am. I'm just the collector of these devices, and I just want to make sure I had an opportunity to show you what they look like. Okay? Anybody have any questions or anything particular you guys want to know, you can give them to Dr. Holliday. But that's about all I have today.
Good?
Go ahead, quick.
Okay. So I actually have the visuals. So a little background on me. My name is Dr. Holliday, and I have been studying the effects of nicotine on the adolescent brain since about 18. So it's been over a decade for me, so I'm a little bit an expert on it. And I came and gave this presentation last year and was asked to come back, primarily to give you an idea of the long-term consequences of what nicotine is doing to your kids. Also, why adolescents are more prone to be doing these behaviors and why it's so much of an epidemic now, and kind of what you can do as parents. Kind of sad that none of the students are here, but that's okay. What you can do as parents too to kind of help or prevent what's going on. So this is more educational. Feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions, and I'll give about a 10-minute, 15-minute talk, and then I'll open it up to questions as well. So the first big thing is your generation, probably my generation, we all knew that tobacco-related deaths were one of the most preventable kinds of deaths that we had when it was a public health crisis. But this isn't really what we're facing anymore. What we're facing is an epidemic of kids using way more nicotine than probably what we grew up with, what you grew up with. And now, with the rise of e-cigarettes and the rise of vaping, it's priming kids to eventually start smoking conventional cigarettes, but at a later start point than probably what my generation did, where most people were starting before they were 18 or 25. Now they're starting to use it much earlier in middle school and in high school, and they're more likely to continue smoking or switching to the traditional cigarettes at a much younger age as well. So we saw a little bit of what those vaping mechanisms looked like, and I just kind of wanted to give you an overview on the evolution of these, because they really started off as these stick mechanisms, like these little pens that had a preloaded cartridge in it, and they were marketed specifically for adults to quit smoking, because we knew how detrimental smoking or the combustible tobacco leaf was to lung development. So the number one priority was getting people off of traditional cigarettes and moving to these vaping systems. But we always knew that there were problems. It was never a solution. It was a substitution to eventually get people to quit. Well, obviously, because of the rapid delivery of the nicotine to the brain, it's a lot more effective than smoking cigarettes. So companies started monopolizing on this. And now what you see are these much larger vaping systems where the battery is much larger, which means that you can have a more effective delivery system, and you can deliver even more nicotine at a much lower volume compared to what was traditionally done. And so that's why we've moved from this all the way up to these honking things here, and now they've scaled it back even farther into the Joule mechanisms that are as big as a USB. And those are things that your kids can hide from you pretty easily. So around this time last year, the FDA launched a prevention mechanism on vaping and the real cost of youth e-cigarette consumption. And one thing that kids really get behind when you're trying to talk to them about not doing things, they don't care about the long-term consequences. I don't care about the long-term consequences because these things don't crop up for 20 to 30 years. So how do you get their attention? You tell them things like these could blast your face off and make you unattractive to the opposite sex, or these can cause physical damage to your appearance. And I know that's laughable, but that's actually how you can get kids invested in not doing this. And prior to this, this actually capitalized on the advances with tobacco prevention in youth, because one thing that they started going after is like, tobacco smoking makes you smell bad, it makes you unattractive, people won't want to kiss you. So now we can do it, but it's a little more tragic or violent when they're exploding in your face, but that is one of the real concerns with using these systems. So it is on the level of the federal government at this point, like the FDA and the CDC both recognize this as a problem. There are things that they are trying to do to counteract it. But another big thing that's cropping up now that I'm sure you've heard about in the news are the vaping-related illnesses and death. So I just want to touch on this a little bit because I'm not an expert in pulmonary function, like I'm not a lung doctor, but I know this is on everyone's minds too. This wasn't an issue. Really, this wasn't a big issue until probably within the last 2 or 3 years. And I think it's less of a cause and effect, like what are these things that are out there, and more that we have more people switching from the traditional combustible methods to these vaping deliveries. And the problem with these is they're not just the combustion that's going in. You're getting all of the vaporized oils or liquids that are getting into the lung capillaries. and forcing liquid into the lungs. And then what happens is not only do you get the damage, but inhaling large amounts of this vaporized liquid makes it so that bacteria colonies can start to form. And then you get bacterial lung infections that you don't typically see unless the patient has advanced AIDS or a compromised immune system. But these are young, healthy adults that are dying, or young, healthy adolescents that are dying from the vaping. And one reason, I'm sure you guys have heard, like, oh, it might be the vitamin E from the illicit THC cartridges. Like, I know that's a big one that comes up, and it might be, but realistically, these are from the nicotine-related delivery systems, and they're causing lung infections, which is then leading to the premature death. So it's problematic. Any questions on that before I move forward? Okay. So to bring to your attention to the Juul system, this is the new one that's out that a lot of kids are using. You can buy these at almost any gas station here in Galveston. The one that I frequent over on like S and 53rd have like 20 different flavors that you can choose from. So they have the combusting mechanism here. So that's your battery. And again, it's the size of a USB. And these pods, they're called Juul pods, are what contain the actual nicotine. And each one of these pods contains the same amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. Now, that might not seem a lot, but a lot of times you'll hear teens report that they're smoking anywhere between 2 or 3 of these a night, or 2 or 3 of these during the weekend. So what you're seeing are withdrawal-related symptoms in younger adults at much higher levels of nicotine that we've seen in the past. And this is problematic to me as a neuroscientist, and now I'm going to get into kind of the long-term consequences of it. But most importantly, I think the takeaway message from this is the younger you are when you start using nicotine in particular, not all of the classes of drugs, but nicotine makes it so that you'll become more dependent on it later in life or have a lot worse time trying to quit because of the way it hijacks the brain's learning and memory systems. And that's typically why we see a lot of kids with ADD and ADHD also have a high comorbidity with smoking or with vaping. But the problem is the nicotine can also exacerbate those symptoms. So kids that are kind of borderline and are using these systems and then going through withdrawal if they're at school or they get confiscated are now going to have the same problems. So this is also important. I just want to bring up this graph to highlight a point, mostly on the tobacco side, but I think it's important with the nicotine, is that we can prevent tobacco-related deaths by preventing vaping, but we could also prevent long-term consequences like the physical health consequences if we had promoted more prevention efforts to get kids not to start smoking. Because we've done a great job since the 1960s and the 1970s when the first US Surgeon General's report came out that linked tobacco smoking to lung and throat cancer. And look at this amazing trend downward. And now it's like only 1 in 4 American adults will smoke cigarettes every day. But we could have gotten that number a lot lower, a lot sooner, had we have placed more prevention efforts on youth. And that's why it's important for me to come and give these talks here too. So just a little bit more background, and I kind of went over this. 90% of adults that smoke today initiated prior to turning 18, and 99% of them initiated prior to turning 25. And that is part of the reason why now we have the law that just went into effect in Texas, California, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, where tobacco products and nicotine-containing products, you have to be 21 to purchase instead of 18. And because I'm a scientist, I do have to give you a little bit of background on adolescence, because how many of you actually know anything about it other than back in your day, you know, kids were only supposed to talk if spoken to. But we've come a long way in understanding what adolescence is. And it was first described by Granville Stanley Hall. Don't worry, not going to be a test. I'm just really excited to explain things like this. And he was the first one to write about it and define it as a period of like really dynamic turmoil, which I'm sure you are used to if you were raising high schoolers, right? And he termed this phrase storm and stress. And that is kind of how we conceptualize adolescence in psychology and neuroscience as this period of storm and stress. Partially because of the hormones, partially because of the behaviors, and partially because of every dynamic change that's going on in your body. It's not really related to puberty per se. That's one of the defining characteristics, but it's more of a developmental span where puberty is just one of those hallmarks. Historically, it's been researched as an angle from behavior, but in the last 25 years, we've really gotten to know a lot more about the neurobiology and how the brain is reorderly dynamic turmoil, which I'm sure you are used to if you were raising high schoolers, right? And he termed this phrase storm and stress. And that is kind of how we conceptualize adolescence in psychology and neuroscience, as this period of storm and stress, partially because of the hormones, partially because of the behaviors, and partially because of every dynamic change that's going on in your body. It's not really related to puberty per se. That's one of the defining characteristics, but it's more of a developmental span where puberty is just one of those hallmarks. Historically, it's been researched as an angle from behavior, but in the last 25 years, we've really gotten to know a lot more about the neurobiology and how the brain is reorganizing itself on a massive scale. So you really only see periods of brain development like this 2 times in life. One is during prenatal development, and one is during adolescence. And so it's really important that you minimize as much as you can insults to the brain, because this is going to change the trajectory of normal brain development as we get older and as we move into adulthood. And really, adolescence as a whole gets represented as a time of increased impulsivity, risk-taking, and sensation-seeking, which again, if you're raising high schoolers, I'm sure all of those things are familiar to you. So what do I mean by behaviors? Adolescents, teenagers are more likely to engage in unsafe sex, drive while intoxicated, engage in substance abuse, including the initiation of vaping, be treated for unintentional injury because they're really impulsive. And research suggests it's not due to the lack of experience or inability to assess consequences. Like we were talking about students using their phones in class earlier. They know that there's a consequence. They know something's going to happen. They just choose not to engage in that. So adolescents are capable of adult levels of reasoning, and they can identify the negative outcomes of their behavior, but they're still willing to engage in risky behaviors, which I prefer to term suboptimal choices rather than risk-taking, because they tune out when they hear risk behaviors, but suboptimal choices gives that nice placation of language, I think. But why do they do this? Well, part of the reason why adolescence as a whole is prone to the nicotine and smoking, I know I need to update this to show less smoking and more vaping. Sorry, I'll do that before the next time. But because they're more prone for sensation seeking, they want to feel good, they do these things, the adolescent brain is way more primed to receive reward and be rewarded than the adult brain. So they feel the really good effects of nicotine, and because they haven't been doing it as long, they don't feel the same negative consequences that come with it. So it propels this type of behavior or behavioral cycle where they're using it because it feels good, there are no negative consequences, which continues the use, and then suddenly 2 or 3 years down the road, they're actually physically dependent on it. So another point of, I'm kind of blowing through this too because I know it's late in the day, but another point of adolescence is this theory of dual systems, and I think this is really cool, and trying to explain it is essentially, and I'll just give you, you don't have to read the bullet points, I'll give you the whole summary here, is that teenagers have an overactive reward system called the mesolimbic cortical system, and that's your dopamine system. That's what processes things as reward. I'm sure you guys are familiar, like engaging in romantic relations, running, exercise, eating fatty foods, drugs, all activate the dopamine system. That's matured by the time you're 14, 15, 16. The problem is the executive function that comes from the prefrontal cortex is not online. So I'm sure you've heard that brains don't stop developing until about 25, yeah? Their adult brains. That's the inhibitory system. The executive control is what kicks online. And right at about 24, 25, 26 is when I noticed mine started kicking online and I stopped making suboptimal choices. And this is also when a lot of other neurotransmitter systems are coming into play and maturing on their own. So dopamine is a neuromodulator of these systems. So if that's constantly in overdrive by increasing vaping or nicotine or things like that, it changes the whole way that the brain is functioning. So skip through that. One thing that's really important with adolescent nicotine abuse is that adolescents tend to report that it alleviates their anxiety a lot more than adults do. And I know that's kind of shocking. If you've ever known anybody that smokes in your life, they tell you they do it because it relieves anxiety. But physiologically, it actually does work better in adolescents, and that's why a lot of them will continue to use it. Problem is, when you start doing it that young, you'll have more anxiety problems as you age, and now you're still going to turn to vaping or smoking to alleviate those symptoms. But it's one of those chicken and egg scenarios, which one came first? Was it the anxiety that caused this, or vice versa? But the grand scheme of things doesn't matter, because it's still going to make the same problems later in life. What I particularly study are the learning and memory effects, and this is actually an illustration, I'll explain what it is, from one of my most recent publications. This is actually in the hippocampus, which is part of the brain that is responsible for making memories, not necessarily storing memories, but colloquially that's what it's known for. But it's the ability to process information as it's coming in and then kick that information into long-term storage. Now, can you imagine a situation where that would be important? The classroom, right? So the classroom is one of those situations where you have to retain that information and put it into long-term storage. What I have found is that nicotine actually blocks a lot of the receptors in the hippocampus that allow you to form associative learning properties. And it can be reversed. The way that I've reversed it is through choline supplementation in mice, which is a precursor to one of the neurotransmitters. And other people have looked at things too, aside from doing things like Chantix or varenicline, which is one of the quit smoking aids. Why is it so vulnerable? Just to go over this in like the key points is that they are more prone to those suboptimal choices, and the maturation of the mesolimbic cortical system makes it so that they're more sensitive to the rewarding aspects of these things. This is a slide that I really like to show, especially to parents and students, because it highlights not only is this happening on a wide scale whole brain change, but we can actually observe it at the cellular level. So this is research from when I was a graduate student at George Mason in Fairfax, where we administered nicotine to adolescent rats and adult rats, and then we had our controls, and then we compared what's known as these medium spiny neurons in the nucleus accumbens, the nucleus accumbens being the real reward center in the brain. And what we found are the adolescents that were exposed to nicotine had way more complexity in their nucleus accumbens neurons, those brain cells, than the controls, and compared to adults. So here is a great example, a very tangible example, and real life like neuroscience research, where it's modifying the ability for these brain cells to make connections or process information, and that's going to persist. We were able to show that this persisted all the way into adulthood. So that is an important part of what I do, is looking at these changes and then knowing how I can modify them. Talked about that a little bit. And so now I just kind of want to end the talk a little bit on what the current policies are and how we're trying to get people, or get teenagers and high schoolers not to do this. The CDC has reported that the most effective forms are the aggressive counter ad campaigns, and I did kind of bring up, like, if you can make them look aversive, especially, I shouldn't say opposite sex, that's a little dated. I should say to their romantic interest. That is what is keeping them from actually starting. Also these rat poison and secondhand smoke, those were effective when they first came out. We're finding that they aren't quite as effective anymore because, I should hedge that a little bit, it has worked in getting us to reduce tobacco consumption. It's not working to reduce the vaping, because now we're just getting people to switch. And then again, while this is good in theory, it doesn't take into account the impulsive nature of some adolescents. So even if we do the aggressive counter campaigns, they could just as easily turn to something else, as they did with vaping. You take that off the market, well, they could just as easily be doing something else. And you know, back in the 1950s, when smoking wasn't that big of a deal, they were all cruising around in hot rod cars without seatbelts. So I mean, there's always going to be something that's going on. This is just problematic because this is what's happening today. So the final suggestions that I have for you, and as parents, and for none of the students, actually there are no students in here, I guess, except for you, thank you. But we want to prevent them not only from initiating the tobacco, but initiating the vaping to prevent these long-term changes. And how do we do this? Honestly, the best advice I can give you as parents is be open, talk to your kids, be vigilant, know what you're looking for, know that these can look like USBs, know that if you smell cotton candy coming from your son's room, that might actually be vaping and not something else. Like, be vigilant of things. And honestly, just be open and willing to talk to them. Know that they have consequences, whatever those consequences are that you want to provide them, But you have to be able to have an open and honest dialogue and say, I'm just worried about these long-term effects of you, not necessarily in the now. And that's really what we can do, because the government is trying to regulate it more. We're trying to bump up the ages, but you've also got to counter all of these shady gas stations in Galveston that will willingly sell them to your kids. So being involved is the best way to do that. Okay, so that is my spiel. I have lots more data, but I'm not going to go into that because it's late in the day. It's a little much. But if you have any questions, feel free. If not, I dismiss you, and you can go about your day.